Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I am Susan Winkler, and I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA. The Foundation is pleased to host this important discussion about recent draft guidance from FDA on considerations regarding non-interventional studies for drug and biological products. Now, before we dive in, let me give you a brief overview of the agenda. In just a moment, Dr. John Ciccato will provide some opening remarks. Then Dr. Tala Fakhouri and Senior Counsel Stephanie Krause will present an overview of the draft guidance. And then we will turn to a time for questions and answers with our team from FDA. For those of you who have been joining us regularly, we have completed 5 webinars on each of 5 guidance documents that have been released by the FDA. Today, we are exploring the 6th guidance document. If you are interested in viewing the recordings of the prior webinars, please visit the Foundation's website at Reagan-Udall.org. So a reminder of why we are here today. FDA recently released draft guidance on the topic of considerations regarding non-interventional studies for drug and biological products. A link to the guidance can be found in the Zoom chat now or on our website with the other event materials. I'll note that I have my copy at the ready as we prepare to hear from our speakers. I'll note again that FDA is very interested in comments and questions from the public about the guidance document. So please submit those to the docket, or if you have questions you would like considered to be addressed today, submit them through the Zoom Q&A box. With that, I am going to step out of the way and introduce our first speaker, Dr. John Ciccato. He serves as the Associate Director for Real-World Evidence Analytics in the Office of Medical Policy in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. Dr. Ciccato, I'll step away and you may have the microphone.
Thank you very much, Susan. Welcome, everyone. So we can link today's discussion back to FDA's Real-World Evidence Framework for Drugs and Biological Products of 2018. As the title implies, it is relevant to the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and the Oncology Center of Excellence. Although we collaborate and communicate frequently and readily with our Center for Devices colleagues, they have separate regulations and their own real-world evidence program. Back to drugs and biologics, the program has different work streams, including internal agency processes such as consults to review divisions, external engagements such as listening sessions for a real-world evidence subcommittee, demonstration aka research projects such as Health and Human Services UO1 awards, and last but not least, what we're here to talk about today, guidance development, which happens to address congressional mandates and Prescription Drug User Fee Act commitments. So relevant to today's webinar topic, terms for study design in clinical research include interventional studies, aka clinical trials, which are defined in part by participants being assigned to a treatment according to a study protocol. With regard to today's guidance, we are talking obviously about non-interventional or otherwise known as observational studies where patients receive treatment during routine medical care, even if they receive laboratory imaging procedures per a research protocol. With this slide, we step back to take a look at the broad landscape of real-world data and real-world evidence. Focusing on the center of the slide, we have 3 categories of randomized interventional studies, non-randomized but still interventional studies, and finally, non-randomized and non-interventional studies. A little bit of jargon, but the next row down is more familiar to those of us who work in this space. Traditional randomized trials can use real-world data in planning, such as to assess enrollment criteria or trial feasibility or to support the selection of trial sites, but FDA does not consider that use of real-world data to be generating real-world evidence on a drug outcome association. The 3 boxes to the right, however, do so, i.e. generate real-world evidence. So trials in practice settings are one example where, say, a point-of-care trial collects outcomes using electronic health record data, or the next box over, externally controlled trials, where a single-arm trial has an external control group that is derived from a real-world data source. And then, of course, what we're here to talk about today, again, happens to be on the right-hand side of this slide, observational studies, whether they be cohorts, case controls, or other types of observational studies. In terms of the figure just shown, this slide shows that FDA guidance over the past couple of years is covering the entire real-world evidence landscape. Starting at the top, we have a procedural guidance on submitting real-world evidence to the FDA. The next two rows down, EHR claims data as well as registry data are real-world data sources, so the data considerations guidances. We appreciate that our data standard regulations did not anticipate the era of real-world data, real-world evidence, so we have a guidance to talk about the submission of real-world data to what was otherwise clinical trial-based data sources. Next, we have regulatory considerations that covers the entire waterfront in terms of where our regulations do and do not apply. And then the last three rows you see are design considerations. The prior webinar was on externally controlled trials. This webinar is on non-interventional studies, and we have a randomized trials and clinical practice setting guidance, which is under development. So with this introduction providing hopefully helpful background and context, we can now dive into the guidance document itself. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Concato. And now I am pleased to introduce our next set of speakers who provide an overview of the draft guidance. Dr. Tala Fakhouri is the Associate Director for Policy Analysis in the Office of Medical Policy Initiatives in the Office of Medical Policy at CDER. And Stephanie Kraus is Senior Regulatory Counsel within the Office of Regulatory Policy within CDER and FDA. So Stephanie, I'm going to turn to you first, and we're looking forward to your comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. Great. As John noted, we have a suite of complementary real-world evidence guidance documents, and Tala and I will now walk you through our non-interventional studies guidance. Generally, this guidance focuses on non-interventional studies that are used to provide substantial evidence of effectiveness or safety of a drug. It provides considerations regarding the design and conduct of non-interventional studies that sponsors should consider when using these studies for regulatory purposes. We begin by defining certain terms used throughout the guidance. FDA has harmonized the definitions of real-world data and real-world evidence across the agency. Real-world data are data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. Real-world evidence is clinical evidence about the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product derived from analysis of real-world data. We also define a non-interventional, otherwise known as observational study, as a type of study in which patients receive the marketed drug of interest during routine medical practice and are not assigned to an intervention according to a protocol. The guidance is grouped into three sections: an overview, a background for the guidance, and considerations for conducting non-interventional studies. Let's start with the introduction section. This section provides the definition of a non-interventional study that I just talked about, gives examples of these types of studies, and explains how this guidance relates to other guidances in our suite of real-world evidence guidance documents. In the background section, we talk about the impact that confounding and other sources of bias can have on inferences that can be drawn from non-interventional studies, and stress the importance of identifying and addressing confounding and other forms of bias so we can distinguish a true treatment effect from other influences. Moving on to the consideration section. This section is designed to assist sponsors in identifying and addressing commonly encountered challenges when using a non-interventional study for regulatory decision-making. Let's start with the overview. The overview summarizes a key take-home message from the guidance, which is that sponsors should engage with the FDA in the early stages of designing a non-interventional study. We understand that detailed information may not be available or feasible to include at the time of early engagement with the FDA, but that shouldn't prevent early engagement. Successful proposals for non-interventional study design should ultimately address each of the elements that we describe in Section 3 of the guidance. Now I'll turn this over to Tala to discuss those elements and the remainder of the guidance.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So what I'll do now is I'll walk you through the remainder of this guidance, starting with the summary of the proposed approach. In this guidance, we note that sponsors should finalize the study protocol, including the research question of interest and the rationale for the study design, before initiating study conduct. We also note that sponsors should describe briefly the approaches and candidate data sources they considered before deciding on the proposed approach, and discuss why alternative approaches, such as randomized trials or single-arm trials, were not feasible in answering the specific study question. Then we also note that the discussion should reflect really an in-depth understanding of the use of the drug or the drugs of interest, the outcome or the outcomes of interest, as well as the capture of exposure, outcomes, and relevant covariates in the proposed study population. Now, to enable FDA to evaluate proposals for non-interventional studies, sponsors should provide information on a list of attributes that we provide in the guidance and are listed here on this slide. Specifically, we ask for information on the research question or the study objective and hypothesis, the rationale for using the proposed non-interventional study design, the choice of the study design, whether it's a cohort study, a case control study, or self-controlled, and then finally proposed selection of data sources to address these study objectives and hypotheses, as well as any alternative data sources that may have been considered. Additionally, and also to enable the FDA to evaluate these proposals for non-interventional studies, we note that sponsors should provide information on study attributes that are listed here and in the guidance. Specifically, provide information on the results of any preliminary or feasibility studies conducted to assess which data source is fit for use to address the research question that is being posed and to estimate, of course, the statistical precision of a potential study without evaluating the outcomes for treatment arms. We also would like information on the proposed approach to support causal inference, whether you're using target trial emulation or another conceptual approach in order to address confounding and other types of bias. And then we also ask for information or description on how ethical considerations, such as issues related to human subject protection, were addressed. After the summary of the proposed approach, we go into the study design, and that's section 3C. Based on the pre-specified research question that's been identified, we also asked the sponsor to provide information on critical elements that are included here on this slide and in the next few slides, but also included in the guidance. Specifically, we asked for a description of the schema that describes the overall study design, as well as the causal diagram to specify the theorized causal relationship. We also asked for information on the source population, and this is the population from which the study population will be drawn. And then for eligibility criteria information and the study population. And the study population is basically the population from which analyses will be conducted. And we ask for conceptual and operational definitions for key variables of interest and the status of any validation efforts that's been conducted to that point for these operational definitions as relevant. Also in the study design, we ask for information on any relevant covariates and corresponding strategies to address potential bias. Importantly, we would like to have information on the index time, also known as time zero, for all study arms and the approach to assigning that index date, including strategies to address potential bias that may be introduced by issues related to immortal time. We also asked for a description of the start and end of follow-up at-risk periods, the planned approach to censoring, and anticipated losses to follow-up, including the depletion of susceptible patients. After the study design, we list important attributes that we'd like information on as it relates to data sources. Okay, so for data sources, sponsors should demonstrate the appropriateness of the proposed data source or data sources to address the specific hypotheses and research questions. Given that, as many of you may know, that the data sources used in non-interventional studies are often generated for purposes other than research, it is important that sponsors understand the potential limitations of such data sources and determine whether those limitations can be addressed or if another data source should be pursued. Now, for the data sources section, we also list a list of attributes that we'd like information on. That includes the description of the proposed data source or data sources, how that data was originally collected, the rationale for choosing the data source or data sources, the relevance of the data to the drug outcome association of interest and that is being studied, the appropriateness of the information on relevant confounding factors, and then, of course, available information on data reliability, including the method of accrual from the source data. The data sources section continues with additional lists of important attributes, and that includes a description of common data models that may have been used to provide a standard structure for sharing data from the various sources, and the rationale behind the choice of the specific common data model. Available information on the timing of assessments for key data elements and the completeness of these key data elements is also important. And then the explanation of how the proposed coding is appropriate based on operational definitions of key variables. And finally, the appropriateness of the data relevant to the target patient population. That data sources section actually ends with 3 additional attributes, and that includes the quality assurance activities that will be performed on the extracted original source data, existing or potential links to other data sources. So you can think about merging data from an EHR or an electronic health record to claims databases, or linking a real-world data source to a mortality database to confirm outcomes. And then, of course, plans for any additional data collections as applicable. We end the guidance with section 3E, which is on analytic approaches. And as you can see, a lot of these sections are really interrelated. So you might see some information that may be connected or repetitive with some of the other points. For the analytic approach, we note that the pre-specified statistical analysis plan should address the specific study objectives and detail the primary analyses and any secondary analyses. The plan should include information on various attributes that are listed here and in the guidance, and this includes the assessment of feasibility, including sample size calculation, and anticipated operating characteristics such as statistical power. Also, the statistical approach or method used to evaluate the treatment effect, including specification of the estimand. We provide examples such as handling of intercurrent events and rules for censoring. We also ask for information on the specific approach to account for potential confounding factors, including assessment of unmeasured confounding. The pre-specified SAP or statistical analysis plan should also include information on the evaluation of potential over-adjustment for intermediate variables that may be on the causal pathway between the drug outcome relationship. Then the approach and rationale for subgroup analyses, if these analyses were done and as applicable. And then the approach to address the potential for unequal detection of outcomes across compared groups. This is really addressing that issue of differential surveillance or differential misclassification. And then the approach to evaluate the potential for early manifestation of the outcome prompting the exposure. And really, this is touching on an important issue in non-interventional studies, and that is reverse causality. The pre-specified statistical analysis plan should also include information on the approach to handling missing or misclassified data, another issue with the use of some of these data sources, and the approach to handling multiplicity. We also ask for a description of planned sensitivity analyses, including details on which factors are proposed to be changed and the rationale for such changes. So we are really looking forward to all of your feedback on this guidance. And as noted earlier, the comment period is open until June 18th. We welcome your feedback either via an electronic submission or as a written submission. The FRN notice includes this information listed on this slide, but you also have access to it now in case you need direction on how to submit your comments. I would like to acknowledge all of our colleagues within the CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, who were really instrumental in writing this guidance, specifically other colleagues from the Office of Medical Policy, Office of New Drugs, Regulatory Policy, the Office of Strategic Programs, Surveillance and Epidemiology, and of course, the Office of Translational Science. We also collaborated on this guidance with colleagues from other offices and centers, including our colleagues in the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, the FDA Oncology Center of Excellence, and then our devices colleagues in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. Thank you very much. And I think now we move on to the closing remarks and questions.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Dr. Fakhouri and Counselor Kraus. That was really helpful to walk us through the content of the document. And I can say from the questions that we got before this event, as well as the questions that are coming in through the Zoom Q&A chat, that we have quite a few to sift through. So let me first remind our attendees that we will be posting the slides that you just reviewed on the Foundation's website after today's event. That is Reagan-Udall.org and under events. And so now let's turn to discussion. I don't think we are going to get through all of the questions that have been submitted, but we will get through as many as we can. So to get into the discussion, I welcome our speakers, Dr. Concato, Dr. Fakhouri, and Senior Counsel Kraus, to come back on screen and let's dig in. I'm going to start with one that well, it digs into the word interventional. So here's the question. Would you clarify what you mean by interventional studies, and then how are interventions defined in a non-interventional study? Dr. Fakhouri, do you want to take the first shot at that one?
Sure, I'm happy to take that one. And this is, the essence of this guidance, non-interventional studies. So this is described in the guidance. We've also touched on that elsewhere, and John just presented on this. But a non-interventional study is a type of study in which patients receive the drug of interest during routine medical practice, rather than receiving that drug according to a protocol. In contrast to a non-interventional study, interventional studies, which sometimes we refer to as a clinical trial, are a type of study in which participants, either healthy volunteers or volunteers with certain specific conditions or diseases being studied, they are assigned to one or more intervention with a drug according to a study protocol to evaluate the effects of those interventions on subsequent health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. Importantly, and we provide examples, John provided that example, examples of non-interventional study designs for evaluating the effectiveness or safety of a drug include things, but not limited to just these examples, observational cohort studies in which patients are identified as belonging to a study group according to the drug or drugs received or not received during routine medical practice, and subsequent biomedical or health outcomes are identified. There are other categories, including case control studies, in which patients are first identified as belonging to a study group based on having the outcome, the health-related biomedical or behavioral outcome. So outcome first, not drug first. And antecedent treatments are received, are then identified. Then there's a third category, and we include that as an example in the guidance, and John mentioned that too. This includes self-controlled studies such as case crossover or self-controlled case series types of studies where the person serves as their own control. So these are some examples of non-interventional studies, and I hope this draws this contrast between interventions and non-interventions.
That was great. And I think what was most helpful is we avoided using intervention and non-intervention in the same, we helped explain it without saying intervention any more times. So excellent. Because of our time, I'd like to move to another question, unless John or Stephanie, you want to add anything to that one. Okay, let's move to a second one. Oh, this one is a bit about timing. So this question asks, does the agency require that non-interventional protocols be submitted prior to study initiation? Stephanie, does that fit in your bailiwick?
Yep, happy to answer that one. It's generally in a sponsor's best interest to talk to FDA early in the design of a non-interventional study, and especially before finalizing the protocol and initiating the study. We actually discussed this topic at length in our guidance on regulatory considerations when using real-world data and real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for drugs and biological products. And so what we state in that guidance is that early engagement will actually help identify challenges with the proposed non-interventional study design or selected data sources in answering the questions of interest and how those challenges can potentially be addressed. So definitely please come talk to us early.
I was going to say I'm in moderating these webinars. I underline that as a key component of most of these, and it came up in a discussion about rare diseases and natural history studies. So it's a similar, I think, structure. Come in early and have the conversation. Thank you. Okay, so here's one. This might be best for you, John, but I'll let you determine that. Can real-world evidence generated from non-interventional study designs be used to support labeling claims, such as to add a new indication?
Thanks, Susan. I'm happy to take this question. The short answer is yes, potentially. A long answer is that the evidentiary standard to support a labeling claim for effectiveness is the same. You cannot emphasize that enough, regardless of the data source involved or the study design used. So to support a new indication, sponsors must provide, and many of you know this, substantial evidence of effectiveness from at least one and often two adequate and well-controlled investigations. These adequate and well-controlled investigations are described in FDA regulations. None of us memorize this, we just know it. It's 314.126 if you're curious to look it up or Google it. But regardless, FDA uses those criteria independent of whether a sponsor submits an interventional or a non-interventional study, as the three of us have described in this webinar. Does that help, Susan?
It does. And so I appreciate it and internalized the yes, potentially.
Well, and by that, I mean FDA is open-minded. We are willing to consider, but the truth is that there are more challenges to conduct non-interventional studies in general vis-a-vis interventional studies or clinical trials. So that reality should be recognized.
I think that might be helpful. That might be a good transition to talk about the data sets, which is the question I'm going to pick up next. So moving from the evidence generated back to that source material, what are the agency's expectations on fit for use data sets involving sources of real world data? Dr. Fakhouri, do you want to pick that one up?
I can take that one. It's also, we talk about data sources, the importance of the data and the guidance. This is also an issue that we address in the other RWE guidances, and it's a very important issue and a very important question. As we note in the non-interventional studies guidance, but also in the other guidances, FDA's focus is on the reliability and the relevance of real-world data. And we describe what we mean by these two concepts. We view reliability as including accuracy, completeness, traceability of the data. We also describe the term relevance, and we say this includes the availability of key study variables, including exposures, covariates, and outcomes, and I emphasized that in the presentation just a few minutes ago, as well as having sufficient numbers of representative patients in the final analysis. Determining whether an RWD source or sources are reliable and relevant can be difficult, it can be challenging, and it doesn't lend itself to a checklist approach, right? So instead, this really takes a lot of kind of multidisciplinary approach where you have clinical, statistical, and regulatory evaluations to make sure that the data is actually fit for use.
And within that, I think it's accurate that it also, right, it's fit for use depending on the question that you're exploring.
Right. And this is where, you know, when we think about relevance, it has to include all of the key variables, all of the key elements to be able to answer the research question.
Yeah. Susan, may I interject?
Yeah, please.
I agree with everything that Tala said. I would just also add that sometimes we see sponsors do what might be described as a good job with the data set available in terms of the study design and the analysis. But the data set itself, as Tala and Stephanie said in their comments, is just not sufficient, not up for the task, not quote unquote fit for use. So I think sponsors have to be realistic in evaluating whether or not the context is suitable for a non-interventional study. The most elegant design and rigorous analysis doesn't make up for data that are not reliable and relevant, as Tala mentioned. Thank you.
Great. So it's that twofold part. You have to have an excellent and well-structured plan and approach, but you also need to be working from data that is appropriate for the question that you're exploring.
And as a clinician, I'll add, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, we don't blame the clinicians at the bedside for having collected the data for the purposes of patient care, not knowing that a sponsor or FDA or anyone else as a researcher would come along years later and try to do an analysis. Thank you.
So that's really helpful in helping us connect how we construct the study and then the components about the data. So I want to pick up another data question, and this relates to data standards. So will the FDA accept data standards other than CDISC for real-world secondary databases? And what has been the agency's feedback on submissions of non-interventional study data that's in the CDISC format? I feel like if I said CDISC format, that needs to come to you, Councilor Kraus. Does that sound right?
That sounds right. I'll take this one. It's a great question. And there actually also was a question about this in the Q&A that relates to SDTM data files, which is part of the CDISC standards. And we appreciate the opportunity to discuss another guidance in our suite of real-world evidence guidances. So we address this issue in length in our guidance on data standards for drug and biological product submissions containing real-world data. In that guidance, we emphasize that our study data standards apply regardless of study design or data sources. We also discuss the challenges, as John mentioned earlier, in applying our current data standards to study data generated from real-world data sources, but we do provide means by which those challenges can be addressed. So if sponsors are going to seek a waiver of any requirement for submitting study data in CDISC format, they would follow the same process regardless of the data source.
Okay. And so that's a good reminder. I think you had it structured this way in the beginning, Dr. Concato, where the guidance documents were together. They really interrelate and are building blocks in thinking through this process.
Yes, this issue comes up from time to time. One could theorize that we might have attempted to write a single so-called Uber guidance, but that would have been very long and arguably hard to find what you need. So it's more of a modular approach. We've received positive feedback about that. We hope that most sponsors and other external entities find it helpful.
Sometimes it's the only way to get through a big topic is to address discrete components of it. Great. Well, so then let me turn to a question about this is from one of our folks who I guess wants to learn from those who have gone before them and maybe avoid similar mistakes. So here's the question. Based on FDA's experience thus far, what are the biggest mistakes that sponsors make with regard to the design and conduct of a non-interventional study? Dr. Concato, do you want to keep the mic for that one?
Sure, thanks. I think in answering the question, I'll first point out that among the mistakes that can be made in designing and conducting a non-interventional study, it's what I referred to earlier, that sponsors don't recognize the inherent limitations of the real-world data source being analyzed. One has to be really, honest and realistic about that evaluation. So stated another way, the best design, I think I said this earlier, and the most sophisticated analysis cannot overcome the problem of data that are not reliable and relevant. But going beyond that, I think other problems that we see would include the expected challenges of sources of bias and confounding. And I think I saw a question in the chat about, well, exactly what type of biases should we worry about? I mean, I don't want to cop out by saying, quote, it depends, close quote, but it really does depend on the context. So this takes, just like there's rigorous rules for conducting clinical trials, there's rigorous rules for conducting observational, aka non-interventional studies, which should be followed. So having the right expertise is critically important. Also on the list, what comes to mind, and this was mentioned as well, is pre-specification. I think it was in Tala's section of the slide presentation, where, clinical trials not only are wonderful randomized clinical trials, have randomization to their credit, they also have that prospective infrastructure. There can be fraud and abuse, but there's, a set of data that typically are very credible. Here, it's not that the data may not be accurate, may not be complete, may not be traceable, but there's also the problem that a sponsor or anyone could do 99 analyses. Sorry, I probably have said this before in another webinar, get a p-value greater than 0.05 each time, do the 100th analysis, and get a p-value of 0.049 and say, I'm going to submit that to the Food and Drug Administration because it's a statistically significant finding, which has a better chance of being accepted among other considerations. So basically, our guidance addresses all of these issues and others as well. But as I think Tala and or Stephanie said, there isn't a checklist. We do not offer one. We're looking for fundamentally good, solid work. But that's another reason to come to us early, to put our heads together. We're trying to help the public improve the public health. And we understand that everyone has a role to play. Thank you.
Excellent. So that's helpful in is back to the idea of have the conversation, know your data, know your plan, and then have a conversation early on. I recognize the guidance can't say it quite that way, but perhaps I can as the moderator. Let me ask another. Okay, this one relates to regulatory requirements related to safety. So specifically, do regulatory requirements for safety reporting differ between interventional and non-interventional studies? All right, Dr. Fakhouri, I'll send that one to you.
I'll take it because we addressed that in another guidance that Stephanie and I were the co-technical leads on too. So we covered this issue in we lovingly call it the regulatory considerations guidance, which is considerations for the use of real-world data and real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making. Very briefly, and you could visit that issue in this other guidance, when non-interventional studies examine the use of a drug in routine medical practice, the agency requires that applicants comply with post-marketing safety reporting regulations regarding the occurrence of relevant adverse events. But we also understand that for these types of studies, the sponsors will often use only a subset of the data. Normally, this is called an analytic data set, and it's a part of a larger real-world data set to conduct their analyses to support a labeling change. If the sponsor is conducting a study to support a specific labeling change, FDA does not expect the sponsor to search the entire database regarding all uses of the product for adverse events that would meet the reporting requirements under FDA's post-marketing reporting regulations. But if during the course of conducting a non-interventional study, a sponsor identifies adverse events that are subject to these reporting requirements, then such events must be reported in accordance with applicable reporting requirements. I hope that helps.
I got it. And I know that every one of our participants is smarter and more engaged on this. So I think they have too. I'm looking at the clock and I think we have time for two more questions if we could. So this one, actually, I can tell in looking at this one that I think it's definitely one that should come to the attorney on our panel. So does the acceptance of real world evidence generated from non-interventional studies dilute the regulatory threshold?
Happy to take that one because it's a very simple answer. Absolutely not. Our evidentiary standards don't change based on the type of evidence being provided. Real-world evidence is evidence that is derived from real-world data sources, while traditional evidence is generated from data collected for the purposes of a study. So either way, our evidentiary standards for approving a marketing application are the same. Yeah, in some cases, it may be more difficult to meet those evidentiary standards when relying on data that were generated for non-research purposes, given the potential limitations of the data that we discuss across our real-world evidence guidance documents.
And so the same regulatory threshold and the guidance documents help you think through when and how the real-world data might be an appropriate way to approach it to generate real-world evidence.
Exactly.
Okay, One last question.
Actually, Susan, before
please.
we get there, can I just sneak in? FDA has been approving what we now call real-world evidence prior to 21st Century Cures Act, but that's a discussion for another day. But if it helps some in the audience understand what's going on here, that I'll offer that comment. Thank you.
It's very helpful because it reminds us that yes, absolutely can be used, and then here are some ways to think through successful use thereof. Okay, last question. What are the best ways to engage with FDA on using real-world data studies? And what is the earliest time point in the FDA scientific advice process to address real-world evidence? I feel like that comes right back to you, Dr. Concato, for the last word on this.
Well, thanks. I guess redundancy in this case is good. Everyone has heard it before. I think Stephanie answered a question earlier. So I'll summarize it with the same wording or the same take-home point that early engagement is key. I can offer perhaps more details by emphasizing that based on efforts over the past few years that the slide set alluded to, CDER, CBER, and the Oncology Center are very comfortable evaluating real-world database studies that generate real-world evidence as part of our normal day-to-day operations. It's not that we do it in our sleep, as they say. Rather, we've put together a strong team, consultations where needed to provide the extra expertise. This question gives me a chance, if time allows, Susan, to mention a new PDUFA, that is Prescription Drug User Fee Act, PDUFA 7 program. It's called the Advancing Real-World Evidence Program. It's a new resource in addition to, not in lieu of, our normal meeting procedures. So this initiative invites sponsors to describe, importantly, before protocol development or study initiation, exactly what regulatory question they seek to address, their proposed study design, and the candidate real-world data sources that they might consider using. So this is an early upstream attempt to avoid the sponsor doing a lot of work, just to have the FDA say, what were you thinking? We really don't see it the same way as you do. So the value added is early dedicated meetings focus on designing a study that potentially can answer a regulatory question. Again, that ultimately is a review decision, but the value added to the sponsor is before too much work is done, countless hours of full-time equivalent effort and countless pages of documents. So more information can be found on our real-world evidence website. Again, the quote, Advancing Real-World Evidence Program, close quote. That's only one of many resources that CDER, CBER, and OCE have to offer in this space.
Great. So it's another door to come in early and have the conversation. All right, that is truly all of the time that we have today for questions. So I want to thank the three of you for providing such great baseline information and then responding to those questions. And I'll thank all of our folks who submitted questions for us to explore. Let me do one final reminder with the slide to submit your comments and questions about the draft guidance to the docket. There is more information on the event page at the Foundation's website. I also want to just thank you to all of our speakers for participating today, and a special thank you to the Planning Committee members at the agency. Thank everyone in the audience for attending and submitting questions. I learned a lot. I hope each one of you did too. So thank you so much. We'll close out. Take care and have a great rest of your day.